welcome to the vBrownBag. Today I'm sharing a deep dive on what I've learned while developing PowerShell on AWS Lambda. The vBrownBag is a podcast by the IT community for the IT community. If you like this content, you know what to do. In this video, we'll explore PowerShell on Lambda, covering core concepts, anatomy of a PowerShell Lambda function, setting up a development environment, finally packaging and deploying your Lambda function. So first, a quick overview. PowerShell is a cross-platform task automation solution comprising of a command line shell, a scripting language, and a configuration management framework. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. AWS Lambda is a serverless compute service that runs code without provisioning or managing servers. You only pay for the compute time used. So why use PowerShell on Lambda? The primary reason is operational consistency. It leverages existing PowerShell expertise within your organization, providing a familiar and productive experience. Additionally, AWS offers extensive PowerShell modules, enabling Lambda functions to automate AWS and system administration tasks. Next, let's look at the anatomy of a PowerShell Lambda function. It consists of three main parts. First is a handler, which specifies which PowerShell script or function Lambda should invoke. The second two are both objects, Lambda input and Lambda context. Lambda input is a PowerShell object containing input data, which was originally JSON that was passed through the Lambda function that was then converted into a PowerShell object by the runtime. The second object is Lambda context, which contains information about the current Lambda invocation. Now, let's look at getting started with a development environment. Since AWS Lambda uses an Amazon Linux distribution, only PowerShell core modules are supported. You can develop on Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. For Windows users, Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, offers the ability to quickly and easily install a Linux VM. For IDE purposes, I recommend using VS Code. It's fantastic for developing PowerShell on any supported operating system. So what's required to develop PowerShell for AWS Lambda? First is the supported operating system. For example, if you're using Linux on WSL, I recommend going with Ubuntu 22.04. PowerShell 7 is recommended. I've seen different versions on the AWS documentation, but honestly, if you use the latest that's available to you, you should be in good hands. The current version at the time of this filming is 7.4.5. Next, you need the .NET 8 SDK, not the runtime, just the SDK. And last, you need the AWSLambdaPSCore module that you can install using the install-module commandlet. Note, if you're using AWS commandlets in your script, you can either install the necessary versions or specify them in your script. The AWS PowerShell Lambda package commandlet will actually download the correct AWS commandlets as needed, so you don't need to have them present in your development environment. So let's look at a screenshot. So let's look at the modules that AWS Lambda PSCore brings. We've got four. The first is get-AWS PowerShell Lambda template, which returns a list of getting started templates. Next is new-AWS PowerShell Lambda, which is used to create an initial PowerShell script or project that is based on one of those templates. We've got publish-AWS PowerShell Lambda, which publishes a given PowerShell script to Lambda. And we've got new-AWS PowerShell Lambda package, which creates the Lambda deployment package that can be used in a CI/CD system for deployment. All of these have great comment-based help, so be sure to review them as you're getting started. And when you do, you'll learn that there's effectively two paths you can take with developing and publishing a Lambda that end with the same results. The first is a standalone script. This is the easiest way to get started. You'll want to use this if you have a single PowerShell script that needs to run on Lambda. This module creates a temporary staging directory when it's packaging, and it adds the necessary .NET build files and outputs a zip file. Next is the project-based method. This is a slightly more complicated method and creates a project folder with the .NET build files in it, which allows you to include custom files in your Lambda function. Ultimately, if you use new-AWS Lambda package, both of these methods produce a zip file, which is ready for Lambda deployment via the AWS console or the CLI. So now that you've got your PowerShell script packaged and ready to deploy, we need to talk about the handler, which is the entry point for your Lambda function and is the method Lambda calls to start your function's execution. Every supported language on Lambda uses a different handler string syntax, but for PowerShell on Lambda, it looks like C# because the PowerShell script is executed within a C# wrapper. If you package a Lambda function using the standalone script method, new-AWS PowerShell Lambda package will provide the handler string and the name of the environment variable to set if a specific PowerShell function within your script needs to be executed when the script runs. This handler string is derived from the script name and will be in this format. However, if you use the project-based method, New-AWS PowerShell Lambda package will base the handler string on the project directory name. You can see the details of that if you look at bootstrap.cs in your project directory. I would be remiss if I failed to mention the publish commandlet, which is available to package and deploy your PowerShell script or project directly to AWS. If you're using the script workflow, you can use the module parameters to deploy to AWS, or the module will prompt for those details during the deployment process. If you're using the project workflow, you can edit the JSON file named AWS Lambda Tools Defaults, and those values will be used when deploying. One thing that I really struggled with while building my first Lambda functions was understanding the underlying file system. When a Lambda function is invoked, your function zip file will be unzipped to /var/task. The only writable space available during Lambda invocation is at /temp. Pro tip: if you're using that to stage files to or from another location, such as S3, be sure to clean up after yourself with remove-item, as there may be times that your Lambda invocation will reuse that same file system and find that storage is full, depending on your Lambda configuration and the size of the files you've stored there. Finally, if you're using Lambda layers, those are stored at /opt. Thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful to you. Good luck and happy coding.